Good evening. Thank you for joining us for this special international edition of Ask the Expert with the Batten Disease Support and Research Association groups across the world. And I'm Ineka Parker. I'm the president and CEO of BDSRA in the United States. And I am joined by my counterpart, Amanda Mortensen from the BDFA in the UK. We have esteemed panelists today to answer your questions, and I'll be introducing them in just 1 minute. I want to remind everyone that this is a recorded session and it will live on our YouTube channel once it's finished so that others can view it. I also want you to know that we will have some Serbian translation provided by Bojana. I forget how to pronounce her last name and I apologize, but she will be joining us as well. And we will accept questions from you in the Q&A, which is where they will appear confidentially. If you want to provide questions in the chat, you can do that as well, but it will not be confidential. It will be posted for all to see. And Facebook Live. So if you want to add questions on Facebook Live, those also will be given to the panelists. I'd first like to introduce you to Dr. Ineka Whiteman. She joins us from BDSRA Australia. She will be our first panelist. We are pleased to have her with us. Ineka, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Amy. Thank you. Thanks for having me here this morning or this evening, or wherever you may be worldwide. So my name is Ineka Whiteman. I am the Head of Research, Medical and Scientific Affairs at BDSRA Australia. I've been with BDSRA Australia for about 3 years now. I came on board when a close friend of mine, her daughter was diagnosed with CLN2, and given my background, which I will tell you about in just a moment, I guess I came on board just wanting to do whatever I could to help not just her daughter, but all of the children with Battens in Australia. And here I am 3 years later, very much engaged and involved, not just with BDSRA, but I also consult for a number of other not-for-profit organisations, national organisations across other rare paediatric diseases as well. So my background is in neuroscience research. I have a PhD in neuroscience, which I spent a wonderful year as a visiting scholar in Colorado, actually, at Colorado State Uni. So I have very fond memories of my time in the US. I have undergraduate degree studies from the University of Oxford in the UK and Sydney, Australia. And professionally, I've had quite a broad range of roles and experiences, I guess. I've worked in research and teaching in academia, liaison roles to federal government ministers. I've sat on the board of Science and Technology Australia. And most recently, before my move into the not-for-profit sector, I was senior medical affairs within the biopharma company Pfizer, which I'm sure we're all familiar with Pfizer these days. And as I said, I'm now very passionately engaged working as a patient advocate for a number of rare diseases. So I'm really thrilled to be here this morning. I will share my screen now. Just so I'm going to begin the talk this morning with a little bit of background. So John and Dave have bravely given me the reins for the first part of this webinar this morning.
Ineka, I'd just like to interject that we do have Dr. John Mink and Dr. Dave Pearce joining us this evening too as panelists. So they'll be providing commentary throughout the presentation and toward the end.
Right, okay, so let me just pop this into presentation mode. I will see. One moment, so. Okay. So can you see my screen okay?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so we have our esteemed fellow panelists here, Professor Mink and Dr. Pearce. So this morning, I want to begin this presentation. Oops. Sorry. I want to begin this presentation this morning, I guess, Despite the recent news surrounding the biotech market and I guess the perceived setbacks with some of the NCL clinical programs and their clinical research and development, I think it's really important to frame this to begin with, that this isn't all doom and gloom. I know there's been, some disappointing news, but I personally, and I know John and Dave and all of us within this, the research landscape, are incredibly optimistic about the future of Batten disease research and the development towards treatments and cures. There is a lot to be hopeful for, and to have measured excitement for, and we'll look to some of those studies today that have made some really important and exciting advances in recent months. This webinar really has come off the back of a joint statement that we sent around a couple of weeks ago from these 4 organisations. So this really was a truly international collaboration. We came together, we really wanted to promptly address some of the issues that we know were really distressing news for some of you, or for many of you. And we wanted to take a moment, I guess, to take stock on the industry, on the sector in the broader picture, and to let you know that this really isn't something specific to Batten disease, this current, downturn that we're seeing in the sector. It's not specific to Batten disease, and it's not specific to 1 or 2 companies. This really is something that's really broadly happening within the sector, a lot of reprioritising of R&D or research and development pipelines. And while it may have tempered the mood, I think a little bit, and perhaps slowed the momentum for some of the NCL research programs, I think, having spent a lot of time in these last few weeks and months and indeed years, but most particularly in the last few weeks, I have spent a lot of time on calls with pretty much all of the companies that we'll be talking about today, all of these industry partners. And I think the overwhelming feeling that I get is that these companies are genuinely invested in Batten disease research. They do have, what I say, serious skin in the game, as it were, and they genuinely do care for the families. And I think, it's something that when we speak about the current developments, they are equally disappointed by these, recent developments. And these really are, in a lot of cases, factors beyond their control. But I want to leave that for a moment and just take a little step back and briefly talk about what biotechs do in the broader sense, I guess, because in order for us to talk about what's happening in the drug discovery and development pipelines at the moment, we really need to understand, I guess, a little bit about the process to understand why this is happening right now in the industry, why we're seeing this downturn in the sector. So if we have a little look at some of the moving parts that drive that, I want to just very briefly give you an overview. I'm sure this is very familiar to a lot of you, but really just a 101 of drug discovery and clinical trials in just a couple of slides, and then talk about the general biotech industry update, and then we'll dive down into the clinical programs. And I have divided these out into subtype by subtype, so we'll have a look at each of those programs one by one. So I guess the first question is, I'm often asked, what's the difference between a biotech and a pharma company? Essentially, they both produce medicines. A biotech or biotechnology company is essentially a product derived from living organisms. So something like gene therapy, for example, which involves viruses. On the other hand, pharmaceuticals or pharma companies create medicines from chemicals or synthetic compounds. So these are your more traditional medicines, I suppose, like your anti-epileptic drugs, pain meds, and so on. Then we have this sort of more liberal term. More companies these days are starting to refer to themselves as biopharm, which I guess is sort of a somewhere in between. So when we look at the drug discovery process, I think this is a really nice image that just encapsulates what is involved. For every 10,000 molecules and compounds that are screened and investigated as potential treatments for illnesses or diseases, only one of those 10,000 compounds will ever make it through to registration, and that meaning that they're able to be prescribed for treatment in human patients. The costs involved at each of these stages are quite significant. If you look at we'll delve down into some of these clinical development stages as well when we talk about the phases of clinical trials. But essentially, if you were to turn this funnel on its side and have a look at the costs involved at each stage of this drug discovery process, we see that there is a significant portion of money required, and this is in US millions. So as we move through this funnel, when we get to the phase 1, 2, and 3, this is really the clinical in-human. So once it moves into blue, this is really the in-human studies and the in-human testing in clinical trials. We see that this really combined, this makes up the vast, lion's share, I guess, of the cost involved in research and development. So we're looking at nearly $2 billion per molecule. So for that one molecule to go from research at the discovery stage, for identification as a target, for a cellular process, it's identified as a target and developed right through to registration to be prescribed into humans, we're looking at about $2 billion. Now, it's a very lengthy and very complex process, this R&D, and it usually takes around a decade of research to develop a new drug and bring it to the market for a specific disease. And this is after this here is really from target to hit. This actually doesn't account for those other 10,000 molecules that are being screened, this high, levels of screening going on to find that one target. So this funding model doesn't even include, I guess, that very early discovery phase. There's a 92% failure rate after a molecule has been tested in animals. So once we get from this preclinical phase here, there's a 92% failure rate. So not only is there a lengthy process, but indeed companies taking on this R&D are taking on a lot of risk in doing this as well. It's important to note that these cost estimates, like I said, don't include this exploratory research, nor does it include post-launch expenses. So things like ongoing collection of real-world data, what happens when this drug gets to market, how do we educate patients, how do we educate clinicians, how do we collect ongoing data to learn more about the drug in the real-world setting. None of this is included in the costs, and of course the other overheads like personnel costs, for example, for employees that are not working directly in the R&D activities, but are actually essential to the company continuing to carry out those R&D. So really, when we look at these phases 1, 2, and 3 within the clinical trial, like I said, this is really the bulk of the expense. If we have a look at clinical trial phases, well, for an interventional study, so where we're testing for a drug or a therapy for treating a particular disease or illness, we have this preclinical phase, which can take up to several years. So in this preclinical stage, it's really the laboratory test, the test tubes and the cell culture dishes and so on, and into whole animals as well. So most typically we think of whole animal research being, mice and non-human primates. In Batten disease, we've also seen studies in canines, in sheep, and most recently in miniature pigs. Once this is sort of, I guess, proof of concept is proven in the laboratory setting, in this preclinical, it then moves into human studies. So this phase 1 is really typically into a small number of humans for the first time. And the main aim in this phase 1 is really to work out how safe this drug is, how well tolerated is this drug, how is it metabolized, how does the body use the drug, and how does the drug affect the body. And typically these are quite short and very closely monitored, these phase 1s. And typically outside of the rare disease space, these are usually done in healthy adult patients. But given rare disease, we have, obviously very small patient numbers in rare disease, and there is a sense of urgency. So generally in the rare disease space, like we see often in Batten's, that the phase 1, 2 are actually combined. So phase 2 is essentially where we move into testing in people with the disease and in higher numbers. And this is really to assess what is the best dose of the drug in regards to both safety and efficacy. So balancing both of those things together. Really, what is the highest, the lowest amount of drug, because less is more in the system. What is the lowest amount of drug to get the maximum amount of effect? And this is where we have dose escalating studies. So we look at increasing doses to see how well tolerated it can be and how effective is it at these increasing doses. So this can actually take years before it's clear whether an experimental treatment is likely to work. If it's a fast progressing disease or a faster progressing subtype, like some of our Batten forms, the treatment effects might not take as long to determine, but indeed these can take up to several years. And once the drug is shown that it has a potential effectiveness and it outweighs the risk of harm, so it's safe and efficacious, then it tends to move into more expanded studies. So this is when we move into the phase 2B or 3. It's essentially just more patients are recruited into the studies. So with all this in mind, and we'll talk about each of these phases when we go into talking about the individual clinical programs going on in the NCL space now. So you hopefully got your head around what each phase means. So if we have a look now at the general biotech industry as it currently stands. So we saw what we call a biotech boom through the 2010s. So from 2010 right through to 2021, we saw lots of startup companies coming to the market and going public. So listing on the stock market with what we call IPOs, so initial public offerings, which inject huge amounts of cash into a company to give them money to move forward to research and develop these medicines. Like you've just seen, there is enormous costs and significant costs involved. So this is one really, I guess, significant way of injecting huge amounts of cash into those pipelines for these companies to carry on with their R&D. So public investment, I guess, was really, during this boom, was really drawn by lots of scientific advances. We saw an exponential increase in gene therapy, in our understanding of gene therapy, in our application of gene therapy. And there was a broader range of investors. I guess as this became a little bit more mainstream, talking about gene therapy and other new technological advances, we saw a broader range of investors coming in, and many companies went public. And interestingly, even during 2021, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, over 100 biotechs in 2021 priced an IPO, which raised a collective, I think, $15 billion in funds in 2021. But in late 2021, a lot of those share prices started to drop. And what this means, I guess, in real terms, is that cash reserves start to dry up as share prices drop. And this was really, I guess, driven by broader economic factors, as well as some clinical results as well. And I guess many programs have been put on hold, shifted to smaller studies or have been discontinued altogether. The companies are having to make these extremely difficult decisions in which programs to reprioritize. And like I said, this isn't just isolated to one or two companies. This is or to Batten disease. Indeed, this is across the board. And I think this sums it up fairly well. This is looking at the number of biotech companies that are facing significant layoffs and significant downsizing. So we see this sort of cumulative effect over since September, really, this data was published in March. We've seen just in April now, another 6 companies have had significant cuts. And like I said, it's important to note that not all companies have chosen to pause or discontinue studies based on financial pressures alone. Importantly, some programs have just not had the clinical efficacy, or there are safety concerns. And the programs that we're talking about today in the NCL space are really, I guess, a mixed bag of all of those factors as to why the rationale behind their decisions in recent months. So I guess really now moving into the stuff that we all mostly very interested in now is where are they all at and why. So I've broken these down into the different subtypes. So we'll have a look at each of these in turn. I've put them alphabetical, but in no particular order. I guess I've just gone from the most common subtype through down to CLN7. Let's start with CLN3 disease. So our major players here, our major companies that are currently involved in R&D are these 4 companies listed here. I'm going to pop through one by one. Abeona really has been around for a while, but what we know is that they do have quite a few gene therapies in the rare disease space in their clinical pipeline, but at this stage, they're still in the preclinical phase. We haven't heard a lot from Abeona in recent months. It really has been, I think, a matter of them just going silent. What the driving forces are behind that, it's hard to say. I haven't spoken with them directly in recent months, but it's certainly something that we've all noticed has gone, I guess, perhaps it's on hold. We're not quite sure. There's a lot going on for Abeona in other disease areas as well with other gene therapies right now. Amicus, I guess, is really one of the key updates that we wanted to share with you, that there has been, I guess, in the February press release, there was an announcement that they had, they're undertaking strategic realignment of some of their portfolios and resources and directing those towards Fabry and Pompe disease programs. They're no longer splitting into two separate companies. At one stage, they were expecting to move all their gene therapy products over to one standalone company. But that's no longer the case. We see the science will continue. So at the moment, they have put their phase 1/2, it won't be expanding. They'll continue to collect the data on these patients. So we had safety data from 4 patients that was presented, I think most recently at NCL last year, the NCL 2021. So what we see is, although there's not statistical, it's not statistically powered to show an effect, we did see some stabilization of those 4 patients, but certainly it was safe, it was well tolerated, there were no adverse, serious side effects. But what we see past 2 years is actually there is not the durability of that stability, and not the durability of those effects was seen beyond the 2 years. So instead, the data will continue to be collected on those patients that have been dosed. But see, the CLN3 program is continuing, I guess now they're going back to the preclinical phase to have a look at optimizing that dose and the route of delivery such that they can, in the aim of seeing the more durable effects of that gene therapy. So I guess my takeout from my many discussions with Amicus, even in just recent days, is that we see their presence at major conferences. They have every intention of continuing. They're very well invested into this preclinical work, looking at optimizing the dosage and the route of delivery for this gene therapy. We expect to see them at the family conference in July, and they're certainly very well and invested in this space. And that's something I think I've taken a lot of confidence from having these conversations with our colleagues, both at the patient advocacy team, the clinical and scientific team, and they're really very much there for us and with us. The other major update for the CLN3 space is this BBDF 101. So as we know, from February, we saw the great news that the phase 1/2 had commenced its active recruitment for this combination therapy. So miglustat, which is a repurposed drug currently being used in Niemann-Pick C and Gaucher's disease. We see that the original intent was for this combination therapy, miglustat and trehalose being a simple sugar molecule that can have effects on what we call the lysosomal master controller. And together these effects were seen in preclinical data to have some promising effects. So this moved into a phase 1/2 where they're actively recruiting adult patients. So this is 6 patients with CLN3 disease, but adults. There's been an interesting development, and you may have seen the press release last week that was sent out by BBDF, and there was a subsequent email to families in the following days that were discussing the fact that there's now evidence suggesting that miglustat monotherapy, so miglustat on its own, is having quite promising effects as a standalone, as a monotherapy. The mechanism of actions were originally, originally designed, the trial was designed around the fact that it was an inhibitor of the breakdown enzymes of the trehalase, which was breaking down trehalose. So it was working directly on the trehalose, and that's why it was part of this combination therapy to begin with. But indeed, as our understanding of the Batten disease pathomechanisms and biological mechanisms are better understood, it looks that miglustat might actually be working in other ways to help improve the disease manifestation through other cellular pathways. Now, look, without stealing the thunder of BBDF and Theranexis, I know they have planned a meeting next week on the 13th of May, Friday, 12:30 p.m. This is their quarterly family research call. I would certainly encourage anyone interested to log into this research meeting to hear more of the details around the rationale and what their, the future timeline is looking like and what their plans are for this. It is really exciting. It's looking to be an expanded study. So whereas there was only a smaller number, I think about 30 patients originally, we're looking at about 60 patients now that will be recruited. Mary Beth Kaiser, who I spoke with just the other day, is very keen to share this with all. She was very happy with me for me to share this with you this morning. but has definitely encouraged anyone interested in further detail to get on that call. You can email her directly. She said, that's fine, I won't give out your email now, Mary Beth, if you're on the call, but certainly reach out to us, Morgan, Amy, or myself, and we're happy to forward those, your email, or forward Mary's email on to you to get in touch for this call. Next, we had the Polarix gemfibrozil. Again, gemfibrozil is another repurposed drug. It's comes from a group of drugs known as fibrates. So it's like it lowers triglycerides, so lowers bad LDLs and bad fats and cholesterols, and increases good fats and cholesterols. It has been listed on the clinicaltrials.gov website, was listed in November 2020. But unfortunately, we haven't heard anything more. I have reached out to the company, but they have gone silent. So we're really not sure where this is at. But safe to say that I think this is just a watch and see, wait and see in this space. So moving on to CLN2, again, our major CLN clinical programs from these companies right now. I think most of us are very familiar with BioMarin. It's quite, I guess, encouraging to see we've just had the 5th year anniversary of BioMarin receiving approval for Brineura, for salicylase alpha, or Brineura. Approval was 5 years ago from the FDA and the EMA. In Australia, we had registration and approval about a year later in August 2018 for the treatment of CLN2. So it's approved and funded across quite a number of markets now. We know there are around 280 children worldwide from 35 different countries that are currently receiving Brineura. We know that the 5-year data is due to be published any day, sometime in the coming months. And this was data that was presented by Angela Schultz most recently at the World Symposium in February, but we hope to see this data coming through. So this is really from that phase 2 study is where we're collecting, and where we hopefully to see this published data coming through soon. There is an observational study ongoing that is essentially for any child that has been diagnosed with CLN2 and is about to commence or has commenced Brineura ERT therapy. They are able to be enrolled in this study. I think it's the US only. Interestingly, we're now moving into ocular studies for salicylase alpha. As we know, although the motor and language scores and the CNS manifestations of CLN2 are stabilized with Brineura, we don't see that with the ocular and retinal degeneration. So there is this approach now to look at treating directly into the eye intravitreally, so injection of Brineura directly into the liquid part of the eye. There is a study going on, commenced just this December gone, enrolling 5 patients by invitation only. I believe this is at Nationwide Children's Hospital, and these are 4 weekly, so every 4-week injections, and it's a 2-year study. Likewise, there is also a study going on at the Gosh in London, but this is not a BioMarin, so not directly funded by BioMarin. This is what we call an academic or investigator-led study. So this is also going on, and this is essentially using leftover drug from the infusions. So these injections are every 2 months. So again, this is, I guess, a wait and watch and see. I think everybody is sort of waiting very eagerly to see what the results of these studies will be. The other thing to mention about BioMarin, we talked about this real world data, what happens when this drug goes to market, and we're seeing this being treated, real world patients being treated over years. And this data is collected. We've seen BioMarin presenting a lot of data in conference proceedings and publications on really important things like, for example, what is the prevalence and incidence of device infections, and how are those managed? Or what is the, over time, because these children are receiving enzyme replacement therapy every 2 weeks into these ports in their brain, in their skull, sorry, that sort of sits outside the skull. But what happens to that device over time, the integrity and the function of that reservoir and that device? We're learning really important things about this, and we constantly, I guess, improving treatment protocols and things, and safety protocols around this, the things that we're learning as our understanding and experience is increased from use in the real world. The other gene therapy going on, there's 2 other gene therapies in development right now for CLN2. So the Lexio program, they effectively, back in 2020, we had phase 1/2 data published from 8 patients. Essentially what we saw was that the treatment was safe and well tolerated, but it didn't seem to have the same effect at slowing the disease progression as, say, for example, the ERT, the Brineura had. So essentially the Lexio made the commitment to go back into preclinical studies, and those are currently underway. So again, I've spoken with them in recent days, and they have explained that preclinical studies are ongoing, looking at alternate routes of administration. So essentially looking at getting this gene therapy more directly into the brain. The previous study was really burr holes straight into, I guess, infused into the fleshy part of the brain through burr holes in the skull. This is looking at getting that either directly into the ventricles or into what we call the intracisterna magna, which is within a compartment sort of more towards the back of the brain, but getting that more directly into the CNS through these alternate routes of administration. So they do have regulatory discussions planned that in the near future that will help guide this future and further preclinical work to look at getting that back into human studies again. So back into phase 1/2 with hopefully this new alternate route of administration. Orpheon are a company that are looking at ocular gene therapy alone, not central nervous system, but ocular. So this is based on a Luxturna construct, Luxturna being the approved gene therapy for an inherited retinal dystrophy caused by mutation in a particular gene called RPE65. It is currently undergoing preclinical research. We had data presented last year at the Family Conference in the US on essentially, I think it was non-human primate data, and they had planned to submit an IND in early 2022, but again, we've not heard a lot more since then. I think, again, the downturn in the market and in the sector has impacted that. We, again, waiting on more updates from Orpheon. So again, wait and watch, I guess, in this space. Regenex Bio, we know, have both a CNS and an ocular gene therapy in development. They had an IND submission that was on clinical hold, awaiting further preclinical data. They announced that in May last year, looking at different doses, dose selection and routes of administration. The advice in recent days, their update is that they are continuing to evaluate the path forward. They've been present at all the major conferences. We've seen preclinical data presented in NCL at the end of last year, World Symposium in February this year. They're still very much in the space, very active. But it really is just a matter of ongoing discussions and evaluations on how they're going to move this particular pathway forward for the central nervous system gene therapy. Likewise, for the ocular, the preclinical studies are ongoing, and they are collecting data on these preclinical studies, and they are also in discussions with regulatory agencies looking at moving this into human studies ASAP. Again, they've reassured us that they will be present at the Family Conference in July and hope to give us further program updates at that time. Next, we have the CLN1 disease. So Taysha is the key company in the CLN1 disease space right now. They have the TSH118 gene therapy, which they had planned until very recently. They had CTA approval from Canada back in December and had planned to go ahead with this CONNECT phase 1/2 study in the first quarter of this year, and the study protocols indeed were under final review. It was a very exciting time. It still is a very exciting time, but now that you can see, I guess, the overall developments in this, biotech sector-wide, this really has been, I guess, a predominantly financial decision for Taysha at this point in time. You can understand now, moving into a phase 1/2 study, knowing that this is the most expensive phase of the whole R&D process, without the sufficient funds and cash, that it's very difficult to move into that study without, I guess, the reassurance and the security of having, the financial backing there. So they have what we call, this strategic pipeline reprioritization at the moment, the CLN1 program is on hold for now, but it's not discontinued. And this is a really important message, and something that I know a lot of families have been quite distressed over. I know time is of the essence, but they are in ongoing discussions daily, from what I understand in my discussions with them, to explore funding options to move forward with a proof of concept ASAP. So this proof of concept is really essentially the same study moving forward, but just in a smaller number of patients. So that really, again, we expect to see them at the family conference in some way, shape or form in July, and hope that they may be able to give us further updates then. As far as the, I guess, great news in the CLN5 space, we know that Neurogene have just started their active recruitment for CLN5 gene therapy in both CNS and ocular. John is on the call. I'm sure he'd be very happy to take any questions directly if there are any questions around this. We expect to see patients are currently undergoing pre-screening at the moment. They will be taking up to 3 patients in this first early phase 1/2 study. And we expect to see the first patients dosed in the very near future. So it is really, really exciting time and an exciting space to be in. So I'm sure John will be willing to answer any questions pertaining to that. CLN6, Amicus, again, are involved in CLN6 R&D. We had a phase 1/2. We saw some results presented most recently, I think, at the NCL last year. And this program really it has been discontinued, not so much for financial reasons, but this is where we talked about, the clinical rationale, in that while we saw in the phase 1/2, in the early days of the phase 1/2, we did see some stabilization of patients and stabilization of the motor and language scores. Beyond 2 years in this extension study, beyond the 2 years, that we didn't see the same stabilization effect. So the plans now are to share this phase 1/2 data. The idea is to continue working with scientists and scientific community to advance the science and the understanding around this particular gene therapy. And certainly this is not, I guess, something that you'd call dead in the water. It's something that will continue to be looked at, will continue to be actively researched. But for now, this phase 1/2 has been discontinued by Amicus. In the CLN7 space, we've got 2. This is the last of the program updates. So we see UTS Southwestern have a AAV9, CLN7 AAV9 CNS gene therapy in development. We saw the phase 1/2, so some promising phase 1/2 results that were presented at Worlds earlier this year in February. They are actively recruiting in this for this study. Taysha Gene Therapies, so they're working collaboratively on this particular program. Taysha have secured, I guess, exclusive option to license the worldwide rights to this AAV9 CLN7. And essentially this is open for recruitment, so whether there's questions on that, we can try and help answer if anybody's interested in hearing more about this. And finally, Neurogene are also in a preclinical phase of development for an AAV9 as well in this space. There was a community letter outlining some of the progress with this preclinical work back in August. And they're also working on 2 natural history studies. So they have 2 programs for natural history studies, one for CLN5, one for CLN7. And I would like to use that as a segue to briefly talk about natural history studies, because I think really we've talked about the importance of, or the role of R&D, the role of biotech in this. Patients actually play, and families play, an equally important role in the R&D through natural history studies. So what is a natural history study? It's not something that's related to a museum at all. I think it's a funny word, natural history studies, but effectively natural history is what is the natural course of the disease in patients that aren't historically, in patients that haven't been treated for the different subtypes of Batten disease. Those that aren't treated, what does the natural progression of the disease look like? And we start to get an understanding of the predictable time course and progression of what that disease look like. Why is it important that we have this data? Why do we need to know? Well, we need to understand the nature and progression of the disease so that we can better forecast prognosis. What do we expect to see in the coming weeks, months, and years in children with the different subtypes of Batten disease? What can we expect to see, and how do we mitigate, or how do we preemptively manage and treat the patients, knowing that this is what the disease course looks like? Most essentially, it's essential for drug development, from drug discovery to clinical design. This is a really, really important ingredient into the process of drug development and moving into approval, into prescribing, into the approved phase. So evaluating the effectiveness of an intervention really requires this natural history data. What do I mean by that? Okay, so if you were to have a look at the solipinase alpha, so this is the Brineura phase 1-2 study. This was the data that was published in 2018 that led to the regulatory approval of Brineura across all these 35 markets that we've talked about. If you were just to have a look at the effect of solipinase alpha on children over time, so this is over a time course of 121 weeks, we see that solipinase alpha, if this is baseline, we see that there's only a very small decrease in the motor and language scores on children on solipinase alpha. But what does that mean? I mean, compared to what? This is where the natural history data is essential. So in those children that we've tracked over the preceding decade, so this natural history data came from patients that were studied and followed, and the data was collected on these patients for the preceding decade before the solipinase alpha study even came into phase 1 studies. We were able to compare, the clinicians were able to compare the difference between those children that were on solipinase alpha and those that hadn't received it over that historical year, the decade before. And what we can see now is that over time, this treatment effect becomes more and more clear, more and more obvious. And this is the sort of data that the FDA and other regulatory agencies use to say, yes, we can see that there is a clear benefit and a clear difference in children that are on this particular treatment. So if you're looking for something, I guess, practical and pragmatic to do right now, I can't speak more highly of the natural history study involvement. And this is something that I talk to regularly with my Australian families that I'm in regular contact with. We have since, encourage many patients and families to move across into these natural history studies just to help, I guess, the wider understanding of the disease progression, to help with the research and development of these therapies. I should state this doesn't give you any particular guarantee or advantage in being selected when clinical trials do come around, but it is an important thing. I know John here on the call at Rochester University, I'm sure we'll be very happy to answer questions if there are any questions specifically pertaining to natural history studies. And there's also the DEM child study over in Germany, and both of those are open to international patients. And you can reach out, I've got those details there, or contact us for those details to reach out to those study leaders directly. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. I think I've spoken for well more than enough. And we'll open to questions if there are any.
So we do have one question with regard to CLN1, and I don't know if any of you can speak to this or not. Is anyone familiar with work from Amicus on CLN1? And can you speak to it?
I'm not familiar.
I don't believe Amicus have put any information out on them working on CLN1.
Thank you. Dr. Pearce, I know that you responded to one of these questions, so you might want to take it after I ask it, but for the sake of others who couldn't see it, BioMarin's Brineura has already been proven safely for the body. Why is the Brineura to the eye trial going to take another 3 years to reach consumer usage?
Yeah, and I'll ask John, because I already typed one response, and then I'll ask John to, to chime in as well. Basically, delivery of a drug to a different part of the body, it's a different route of administration. So in terms of the regulators, whether it's the Food and Drug Administration or the European, regulatory agency, they view this as a different route of delivery. So it has to be proven to be safe before it can be advanced, into, to be accepted.
Yeah.
Is that why, I'm sorry, Dr. Mink, go
Oh,
ahead.
go ahead and follow up.
I was just going to say, is that why Brineura eye data isn't in the UK being combined with the nationwide trial?
I mean, they will have it because if BioMarin is the sponsor, they will have access to the data. How they're viewing that data and combining it will be up to BioMarin with respect to how they do that. But the bottom line is basically the approved therapy is delivering through a port into the ventricle in the brain, essentially. Now putting it into the eye, and how that's distributed is a completely different, type of experiment. And remember, that's the first time that anybody is delivering it to a human eye. So it's an experimental thing, and that's why it needs to be evaluated for safety.
Great.
Yeah,
John?
to follow up on that, these are experiments. We don't know if Brineura delivered to the eye is going to be beneficial or not, and that's why this research has to be done. And just to to follow up on the question of why two different studies, why is one being done in the UK, one's being done in the US, why is it going to take so long, why can't the data be combined? I think there are so many questions that have to be answered. How much enzyme, how much Brineura to deliver, how often? Should it be every 4 weeks? Should it be every 8 weeks? Should it be every 2 weeks? These are questions that have to be answered through research. And the good news is the UK study and the nationwide study are different. They're doing different intervals for treatment. And so eventually when the studies can be compared, there may be some important information about whether it's better to give it every 4 weeks or every 8 weeks. And so I think there are advantages to having the two different trials. Why 3 years? I think it'll take that long to know if this is going to provide any benefit or not, and whether it's long-term safe. So I know it's frustrating how long these things take, but these are really important questions that have to be answered in a really careful and rigorous manner.
We have a question from Facebook. Is there a gene therapy treatment for CLN8? And if so, when will it be approved? I'm not aware of any, but maybe
I'm
you
not
all
aware
are.
of any active. I know that there are some preclinical studies being done on CLN8, but I don't know of any active pipeline that has CLN8 as a target.
Yeah, I think John's right. There has been some published work on the CLN8 mouse model, but I don't know if any company is pursuing that, to the clinic.
Thank you.
I see a question in the chat box that we can all see, I think, Amy. You got that one?
No, I have a different one, but you go ahead.
Is it true that the UK won't give data because it's a compassionate use? This is a question I just don't think any of us can answer. I mean, any information that BioMarin has is that's a question for them. I certainly don't know. I mean, Amanda, you've got your hand up. You want to take that question because you're in the UK? Thank you.
Yeah. So no problem. So I haven't got colleagues from Great Ormond Street here, so I'm literally speaking as a patient organisation. But Brineura in the eyes at GOSH is a compassionate use programme. It's not a clinical trial, and it's funded entirely by families who raised over £200,000. So I don't know what is happening to the data at the end of that, but I'm pretty sure that will be shared meaningfully. And also, Ineka, your fantastic presentation, just one little thing, it actually started in the summer of 2021. So it's and it's an 18-month trial. So actually, so that's as much as I can say, but that's how that was set up. So it's nothing to do with BioMarin.
Mm-hmm.
The question that I was going to have, Dr. Mink, you can probably answer us. What's the difference between what Rochester is doing for natural history versus the NIH?
Yes, so the NIH is doing mostly it's a biomarker discovery study where there's natural history. It's focused solely on CLN3 disease. It's natural history, but it's looking at how disease severity and progression relate to certain kinds of biomarkers. And so they're looking at cerebral spinal fluid, they're looking at blood, they're looking at urine, they're looking at other things that could be biomarkers of disease progression. The study we're doing is all forms of NCL, And it's not a biomarker discovery study. It's really a clinical natural history that includes neuropsychological evaluation, quality of life information, using a rating scale for assessing disease severity and progression, but it's all forms of NCL, whereas the United study is focused on CLM3. We use a lot of instruments in common. We are friends. We talk to each other all the time. But theirs is focused very much on biomarker discovery, and ours is focused on broader natural history across all the NCLs.
We have another question that I'll give a brief answer to, and then I'll let the good doctors weigh in. With regarding to the TAISHA and fundraising towards the TSHA 118, it's been asked when we will be able to discuss the fundraising with TAISHA, or is BDSRA already involved in these conversations? I know that some family foundations would be interested in helping, as well as individual families. What I would like to say about that is that BDSRA in the United States is in regular conversations with TAISHA. There has been no discussions about fundraising, and I don't foresee any of that in the foreseeable future. But rest assured, we have regular conversations with them. I think patient advocacy groups raising funding for biotech is a slippery slope, and it's not one that we are willing to go down that path for at this time.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I think it is a slippery slope, and there's a lot of questions around, equitable access then to the trial. If there's one or two families that are able to raise significant funds towards that, does that guarantee them, that their child will be selected? No, it shouldn't. If it's a good, robust clinical trial, then certainly there should be no favour given to those that have given, any financial assistance to the program. So I think that really is, that's the trouble with private funding in instances like this. So there's no one organisation or one family that's able to, I guess, nor would they be. I mean, this is huge sums of money too. I mean, we don't have a price per se, but having a look at the graph that I shared earlier, this isn't something that's going to be an easily funded process. It takes huge sums of money.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's said. For publicly traded companies that sell stock, nothing prevents anyone from buying stock in that company. But having a charitable foundation provide funding under some agreement carries with it a lot of implications that may not be consistent with laws that govern how for-profit companies operate. And so these are really challenging questions. I'll just leave it at that.
There's another question that's been asked of us. Is a BioMarin designing a better mechanism for delivery of ERT to the CNS, since ports are damaged over time and causing more surgeries and ache infection issues as children get older?
So without getting into the specifics, BioMarin obviously have a robust R&D or research and development program, and we're clearly exploring the next steps for Brineura.
There's been some discussion. I think some patients have moved to chest ports as opposed to the ports within the skull, but I don't know whether or not there's whether or not that's sort of widely used practice now moving. But of course, the development of the devices themselves as well to make them more robust, I think, is ongoing too, as Dave said.
Any other questions?
So I'm going to make one more comment while waiting for other questions, that with this current downturn, Ineka's already said that her contacts with the companies have been reassuring that they maintain commitment and enthusiasm about the overall Batten disease space, as it's called. I want to reassure people on the call that the clinical researchers, the people who carry out the clinical trials, we also maintain our enthusiasm and dedication to experimental therapeutics, to developing and helping develop and ultimately help to bring to market therapies that are going to be meaningful for families. And so the work continues, and the work continues, particularly at the universities, the work continues with a variety of funding sources and not just from our industry partners.
Well said, John. Amy, another one came in the chat box that we can see. If a clinical trial starts in another country, can somebody from the USA qualify? So inclusion, exclusion criteria are totally up to the individuals running the trials. So if a trial is run out, in another country and the same in the USA, people can contact the investigators and see if their participants are eligible. The inclusion, exclusion criteria are based on the individuals, not on where they come from.
Thank you. We received a follow-up question to the Taysha question. What is Taysha referring to? And I don't know if anyone can answer this. When they say fundraising in their recent press release.
I can't comment specifically for Taysha, but when companies do that in their press releases, they're often looking for industry partners, other companies that, or they're looking for, investment capitalists, people who want to invest money in the company. So sometimes it's from partnership with other companies to bring their efforts together. Sometimes it's looking for, again, deep pocket investors who want to invest in the company. That they're not talking about raising money from people who are having garage sales or bake sales or golf tournaments.
Yeah, I can confirm from my conversations with them, and I'm sure they're fine for me to say that that's exactly what they're in discussions for at the moment, for co-development deals along the lines that you've just described there, John.
We have another question. Have any of the doctors ever considered using artificial intelligence technology for clinical testing? It might include safer and quicker way of conducting the studies.
I'll take that to start with in a very simple way. Artificial intelligence requires large data sets and huge numbers. We're dealing with it, and John, feel free to disagree with me, but you're going to need a lot of patience and a lot of information to mine that sort of information to get any direction.
Yeah, though there are forms of what we might call artificial intelligence that are being used. So, for example, one of the things we do, in studying how children walk, is we can use video methods. We can have them walk on a gait mat where we can get their footfalls, but there are now smartphone-based apps where you can video record your child walking at home, and then there was a computer analysis of that to help characterize how steady their walking is, how fast their walking is, et cetera. And so, although that's not artificial intelligence in the broad large data sense, it still is an application of artificial intelligence to pick out patterns from how children move and behave. So it is already being implemented in some clinical trials, not only in Batten disease, but across multiple diseases.
Mm.
Okay, we have, it's really time for us to wrap up, but we have one more question that I'd like to pose to any of you who are interested in answering. Does mRNA technology hold any promise as a mode of treatment?
Dave?
mRNA technology, so one of the cliches I tell a lot of people right now is, as sad as it is, the biggest advances that would have occurred in the 21st century would be because of COVID. And mRNA technology prior to COVID was being explored extensively in terms of how to correct genetic defects, primarily still at the dish stage, so in cells. But what has been learned from the mRNA technology, the manipulation, and more importantly, the stability of these molecules, which are generally very hard to keep stable, has been advanced. Once we get out of this, I will tell you a lot of the companies in the mRNA space are repurposing and getting back to genetic diseases, and there's huge potential, but it's very, very early on.
Yeah. And I'll say, just like what Dave was saying about COVID-19 and accelerating research on mRNA technology, the mRNA vaccine resulted because of the huge investment we made in HIV going back 30, 40 years. And even though a relatively small number of individuals had HIV itself, the investment in that research has paid off in what we've learned to develop and bring new therapies in a variety of disorders. And so, I think that's a lesson for all of us, is that an advance, even within the Batten world, an advance in CLN2 disease moves forward all other forms of related diseases. And so it's this fundamental research that I think is so important, even though if it's not directly leading to a therapy within the next year or two, the knowledge we get from this going forward is likely to be substantial.
I want to wrap up now, and I just want to thank all of you for the time that you have contributed. Amanda, I know it's really late for you to be staying up with us in the UK, so we appreciate you and all your families. Ineka, it's very early in the morning for you, so we're grateful that you got up and spent this time with us. The information you provided was fantastic, and we can't wait to have you back, so we thank you. Dr. Mink and Dr. Pearce are near and dear to our heart and spend a lot of time with BDSRA in the United States. We are grateful for both of your time. And I would just like to ask if you have any parting thoughts before we close the meeting.
No, I guess I will. Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
No, great questions. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, and just to, the hope is still alive, and that's what we want to really convey. This is really important, not to be disheartened by this news. It's really, it will correct itself. The sector will correct itself, and will be, back on target for a lot of these programs. So don't lose heart, and check out the natural history studies.
Nothing more from me. What both Dave and Ineka said, I agree with completely.
We are so grateful for the participation of everyone around the world. And we will definitely have to do this again, because we've had some great questions and some great participation, and I can't wait to work with all of you again. So thank you, Bojana, for your translation in Serbia, and we look forward to seeing all of you again sometime soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.